Hi there, it's Robert.
And I'm Jo.
And we are here today talking about field guides.
Today we're going to be going over some of the history, evolution, the benefits of illustration over photography, as well as how to use a field guide. And you're going to see all the different styles that exist today.
We hope you have fun.
John James Audubon, who lived from 1785 to 1851, illustrated The Encompassing Birds of America, a collection of 435 life-size watercolor illustrations. Though he wasn't the first wildlife artist to attempt describing all of North America's birds, a distinction awarded to artist Alexander Wilson, Audubon's work was the primary catalyst in establishing ornithology as a discipline. As the discipline gained traction, certain American institutions began establishing departments of ornithology, thanks to folks like Spencer Fullerton Baird and Elliott Coues. These departments worked on publishing lists of birds intended for professional ornithologists, whose primary focus was on taxonomy, otherwise described as species classification. These initial books were cumbersome and were not accessible for a variety of reasons. Women who were interested in birds were often excluded from the professional ornithological community, as professional organizations denied their admittance. When women were accepted, they were often looked down upon and scornfully referred to as opera glass fiends by academics. This is because, while professional ornithologists spent their time investigating study skins and dead birds indoors, amateurs and enthusiasts learned by observing live birds in the wild through magnifying devices. Now we understand that outdoor observation in a species' natural habitat can be the most informative means of study. For this, we can thank Florence Merriam. Florence developed what we now understand to be one of the first actual and accessible field guides, Birds Through an Opera Glass, which she wrote when she was only 26 years old in the late 1880s. The intention of this book was to introduce young people and fellow women to birds and their environments, and it featured black and white woodcut depictions. As far as modern field guides are concerned, Roger Torrey Peterson's 1934 Field Guide to Birds is credited as the first. Peterson's paintings of birds were simplified, and he included distinguishing features and characteristics pointed out by thin black lines.
Cool! This is such a neat way of organizing field guides. I love how they've changed. And now we're going to be talking a little bit about the evolution of them, right?
Definitely. Yeah, so we see with Audubon's initial aviary, he illustrated them life-size. And so this wasn't exactly something that you could bring out into the field with you. And this is even like a smaller version of
Can I
his
try?
initial. Yeah, just take that with you.
I'm going on a field trip.
So the first actual field guide as we understand it now would be like Roger Peterson's, and this is the third edition of that, so it's a newer version. But we see that he's characterized them taxonomically, but also called apart specific markings and things, and he's organized them by family. Then we see...
So here we're thinking more classroom textbook.
Yeah, or not even classroom necessarily, but maybe
Natural
academic,
History
Natural History Museum, academic world. This is more intended for carrying with you in your pack when you go outside to observe in nature.
Could you talk a little bit about how these illustrations came to be in regards to being dead versus alive? Some of the differences that you noticed?
So Audubon, of course, wasn't exactly the conservationalist that we think he is. Would shoot up to 20 birds of a specific species or find them dead and illustrate them from the dead study skins.
And that changed significantly.
Yes, exactly. So these, it was rough work, but it laid some groundwork that was necessary for the evolution. These are more based off of observation. Exactly.
It's still so important to also look at specimens, right? It's still a continuous practice that many scientists and illustrators use in order to depict these images. But when we think about this evolution of field guides, it's important to keep in mind those differences, right?
Definitely, and we've seen the extinction of certain species, of course, because of overshooting and overhunting and things like that. So our understanding of taxonomy in relation to like science and conservation, these things are sort of existing in a marriage now, whereas in the past they hadn't.
And then when we move to photography, what are some of like the main differences that you notice?
So of course photography is a great tool in that you are observing the animal in nature and photographing it in its natural habitat. You're not harming that animal in any way.
Yeah.
These are all live living animals, so we can see how they exist in their environments. But it isn't exactly the most clear understanding of that animal, as we discussed with the light and shadow.
Exactly. Yeah, here you can see that you just know that they are in water, right?
And because they're in water, you can't even see the bottom half of their bodies.
Absolutely. Cool. So after we move from photography, what's kind of like the next major step in field guides?
Yeah, so David Sibley is actually probably the biggest name in field guides right now as far as birds are concerned. And he's done this full return to illustration. He's really pared down his illustrations so that there is significant texture and detail, but it's basically just the color.
And then we move on to the latest field guide.
The latest field guide, of course, published this year, in fact.
Which really focuses on particular relationships.
Yeah, species relationships. I think we have this whole history of taxonomy and classifying birds and animals and different plants and things, and there hasn't really been much focus on the actual relationships of these things and how they interact with one another in the environment. We see a little bit about bird life and behavior in Sibley's guides, doing a little bit more like observational work in the field in that sense, but we don't think about those animals in relation to the environments and the environments in relation to the animals.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that we're noticing now as well is focusing on the really local, so thinking about how species are relating at a particular place.
Definitely.
Which is exactly what we were going there for. Awesome. They have changed a lot over the years.
There's been a lot of change, and I think because of this change, it's definitely awarded us that privilege of bringing our focus back into the world around us, in our immediate surroundings, for sure.
And back to illustrating species too.
Exactly, yeah.
Cool.
This is the Audubon Society Field Guide of Birds of North America, and it contains photographs, and we're also going to be looking at the Peterson 3rd edition field guide, which is illustrated.
So, Robert, can you tell me a little bit about what's the difference between working with photography versus going in with illustrations when trying to understand different species?
Definitely. It's actually really interesting. The end of the 20th century, with advancements in photography, it was understood that looking at birds, actual photographs of birds, was the most descriptive way of seeing them. But we're actually seeing with recent field guides a return to illustration, because now we're understanding that eliminating the light and shadow of a bird in a photograph is going to be more specific. So breaking down a bird into a simplified illustration is going to be the easiest way of recognizing them in nature.
Interesting. So when you're talking about shadows, what do you mean?
So in these photographs of birds in this Audubon field guide, which is actually from 1977, you see a whole range of light to shadow in most of these birds, and that can be really helpful in understanding them in their environment and seeing their camouflage. But it's not going to give you the clearest understanding of their markings in all environments.
Cool. And then when we look at illustrations, this idea of the shadows, how does it take place?
Yeah, so what we see here in this Torrey Peterson field guide is that there is no light and shadow. I mean, very minimal, there's light and shadow so that we understand the birds have depth. But as we talked about in our last video, the person doing the observation has done this work of really seeing the bird and calling out its actual features. So in the Torrey Peterson field guides, we see these lines calling out specific markings on waterfowl in this case. So the Canadian goose, you can see that they've marked out its ring on its neck.
Which is something that you might not necessarily be able to see from a photograph.
Exactly, yep.
Cool. Yeah, scientifically, when we are looking at species, one of the things that's interesting about illustrations is that by using pencil and paper, you pay attention to more characteristics.
Definitely,
right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
I think that having a field guide and this return to illustrations is something important to help us identify species better.
Yeah, which was important for us too with our campus field guide. So we're focusing more on relationships, but we've also used illustration to depict these birds, like these flickers here. You'll see that there's a little bit of shading and shadow on these birds, like underneath the neck here on this female northern flicker, but mostly I've focused on the local colors of the features. So you can see that I started with a base of red for this specific marking here, a golden brown for its wings, and I've focused in on the yellow shafts for the feathers.
Lovely. It looks beautiful. This is one of my favorite images.
Thank you.
Okay, so we talked about the history, the evolution, as well as the difference between photography and illustration on field guides. Now, what we're going to discuss is how do we use them. These are very important tools for study as well as recreation. So a few things that we're going to discuss next are key things to pay attention when you're using your field guide.
Exactly. So you can see here we have a very well-loved golden guide to field guide identification of birds of North America.
And I love this.
It's
It really
fully
shows
wrinkled, yeah.
how much it has been used
Exactly.
and the amount of love it has had.
Yeah, so this copy was actually given to my mom by my grandparents and has since been gifted to me. So it's sort of like this multi-generational object. You can see it's organized sort of in a marriage format on most of these pages. You'll see the male version of the bird with the female, and with this being an illustrated field guide, it's very much pared down to its simple colors. We also have some maps on the left side over here, so you can see their range, which is helpful in understanding where you're seeing the bird. Like if the range doesn't match with where you're seeing it, it's probably not the bird you're looking at.
Yes, knowing the habitat and location would be one of the first steps to try to identify a particular specimen.
Definitely. And most of these books are organized by families of birds. So here we see a whole page of owls, not necessarily related owls. So we have a snowy owl, a barred owl, a great gray owl, and you'll see they're organized. You'll have like a whole section of finches, of corvids, our ravens and crows and jays, and waterfowl. So it's helpful to know where in your field guide you can find those families.
Another important thing is also to read the particular behaviors. So if you are observing an animal and you notice they're eating a particular fruit, this would be something that is noted in your field guide, most likely, that will help you further get down to that species level.
Yeah, exactly. What type of diet they have, for sure.
Cool. So this is something that you could carry with you, and Robert has many times.
Definitely. Yeah. It's about 5 by 7.
Yeah, so it's a size that you can carry. And then there has been a move to have even smaller field guides, as well as field guides that you can have on your phone, right?
Definitely, yeah. You can download field guide apps on your phone, and that's actually really helpful for a field guide like this, which is encompassing all of the birds of North America, because you have a lot of things in here that won't necessarily be in your area, so you're carrying a lot of extra baggage with you in that sense. So having it on your phone is helpful. A privilege that we've had, though, in working on our field guide is a smaller pool of animals to look at. So we haven't necessarily broken it down by families.
No. what we decided to do is focus on particular relationships. So if you would notice an animal interacting with another or living at a particular place, those were some of the things that we try to focus on. So for example, if you think about fox squirrels and how they are extremely present in North America, one common behavior that you see is caching by different species of crows. So here we have a raven, and ravens and crows are from the same genus. So very smart birds, and what we try to highlight is particular behaviors that are commonly noticed. So this is a different move when you're thinking about observation. So here you're looking at individual species. Here you're paying attention to how they interact.
Very much so, yeah. Very taxonomical, and this is very in the wild, or candid maybe.
Absolutely.
You could say. Thanks for joining us today. We hope you had fun looking at all these field guides with us.
Thank you, and get outside. Use your field guides.